brothers and sisters. And yeah, to kind of do life together. I am a CPE certified educator. I'm at Duke Raleigh Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I supervise. This is Ellie, my sweet little dog who may bark, which is why she's currently in my lap, because I hope she won't be a distraction. But just excited to be with you all to talk about a topic that can be really stressful. When Jamie reached out, I think when we think about kind of conflict and leadership styles and tools, oftentimes as ministers, we didn't learn that in seminary. That wasn't like a class that we got taught. Sort of how are you with people? How do you show up with people? What do you do when people show up in the world in very different ways? And so part of what we're going to do tonight is just spend some time. There's lots of different leadership tools and ways of talking and thinking about conflict. But today I wanted to share one tool with you that I found really helpful in the work that I do with students and with local parish ministers. And so I'm going to kind of share it. I'm also a very call and response dialogical type speaker. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to answer them. There will be times where I won't do polls. I'm not asking Jamie to do any polls, but there may be times where I'm just like, where do you see yourself? And so feel free to come off mute and kind of speak into the room, because my hope is that this will again be really dialogical and you won't just be listening to me. I will try to leave some time at the end, but also just welcome engagement kind of throughout. So with that being said, I'm going to try to share my screen. That's always the fun part. And all right, can you all see that?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Fantastic. So today I'm going to talk about something called the Leadership and Interactive Styles Inventory. Really what we're going to hopefully talk about is just understanding how the way we show up, how that impacts how we relate to others and how we engage others. I think one of the reasons why it's really helpful to look at leadership and interaction styles is because it helps us begin to identify and understand how different behaviors show up in group, how people are all different. We sometimes assume that like the way that I show up as a leader is the way other people should show up, or we don't recognize, we just sort of tend to kind of assume that like one way of being a leader is right and one way of being a leader is wrong, instead of recognizing, well, there's lots of different ways of being a leader. And so the goal of this is to how do we think more thoughtfully around the diversity that shows up within groups of people. How do we better understand ourselves and understand other group members, and how do we build bridges and form deeper and more respectful relationships? So when we look at things like leadership styles or interactive styles, it reminds us that, like, again, I'm a unique person that shows up in the world a particular way, that come with particular experiences, and other people show up in different ways. And so how to have appreciation for that. And so ultimately, the goal is kind of highly effective performance and feelings of satisfaction. That when we do the work we do, I think sometimes conflict and stress and anxiety like makes life not fun, right? It makes ministry not fun, for me anyways. And when I begin to think about like, maybe that person's not showing up that way to piss me off, maybe it's just because they're different, or that deacon or that elder or whoever that person is, when I begin to kind of get curious about how they're showing up and how I'm showing up, I think it again builds deeper bridges. And so anyways, part of what we're going to kind of talk through as it relates to the leadership interactive style, it starts by basically saying that people lean kind of one direction or another along two strata: an orientation towards communication and an orientation towards focus. And so basically the first thing it says is people are basically inquisitive or assertive. And they have a value. So now it is funny because I think as ministers, we tend to think, well, clearly we're inquisitive type people. Like we want to be good listeners, we want to be good pastoral caregivers. And so we like to all assume that we're inquisitive. But instead of thinking about maybe in a pastoral role, think about just like, well, no, am I kind of basically an inquisitive type person or an assertive type person? And so if you're not quite sure, here's a couple things. So assertive people tend to initiate contact. They tend to make statements, are a bit more forceful. Emphasize points with gestures. I am assertive person because I gesture a lot. You will see that. Sometimes assertive people will compete to be heard. They're just so excited that like got to jump in. Assertive people tend to provide answers, but sometimes rarely ask the same question in return. Conversations don't always last very long, and they spend a lot of time sharing their opinions or knowledge. How many of you know assertive people, or you yourself are like, oh yeah, maybe that describes me? Do we have some assertive people on the call? I can't tell you're all on, that's fine. Thumbs up. So the other style is inquisitive people. And so inquisitive people tend to ask questions. They allow others to speak first. They present a relaxed body language. They rarely talk when someone else is still speaking. They generally respond in greetings by asking, how are you? Then they generally ask further questions about family or health or work. Oftentimes conversations between inquisitive people last longer because they tend to speak less and listen more. Again, when we think about this, isn't sort of an introvert extrovert thing. Oftentimes we think about, well, extroverts are assertive and introverts are inquisitive, and that's not really true. It's more about kind of processing in words. So sometimes there's an introvert who's an external processor, and so they're very assertive, or someone who might be extroverted and want to be around people, but tends to be more inquisitive. But basically this sort of says that people lean, you might find yourself somewhere in the middle or situational, but by and large, part of what this says is like we lean one of these ways or another, and it'll make a little bit more sense in a second. So if we think about kind of a behavioral quadrant, we've kind of got assertive people on one side and inquisitive people on the other. The second thing is around an orientation around focus. And this asks, is a person more focused on tasks or relationships? And so task-oriented people tend to think, well, we're gathering for a specific reason. So the focus of their attention is the reason for the group, and the task matters most. Like, why are we here tonight? Well, we're here because we're about to learn something. So like, let's get on with the learning. Relationship-oriented people gather together primarily for the fellowship. So they focus their attention on the people, and the people matter most. So it's like, well, I got on because I just wanted to see who else got on, because it's just fun to see all these other folks. So you can kind of begin to hear the difference, right? Like, how many of you, again, like task-focused people are like, what are we doing? Like, what's the point? Like, fellowship is great. Yeah, thank you. I see those hands. Fellowship is great, but like, what's the point? And people-oriented people are like, we'll get to it. If we don't do this people-y stuff first, we're never going to be as productive with the task. And so a lot of times, like, I think this is a deep source of tension with folks, because there is this like kind of debate on, are we task focused? Are we people focused? And this, I've been in enough sort of church meetings to know, like, this is one's just easy source of conflict, is that people have different values. And sometimes it's hard to figure out, well, how do we meet both of these needs? And I think oftentimes, again, without thinking about it, we don't often think about it. We often just feel kind of tension when we're in a meeting and we're like, the people-y parts are not a part of this, or why aren't we getting to the point? And so, again, if we, whoops, my thing keeps going faster. Okay, so if we think about kind of task-focused people and relationships as this quadrant. So now we've got inquisitive and assertive, we've got tasks and relationships. And so what this does is it kind of creates, there are assertive folks who are focused on tasks, and we give them the name of directors. We have assertive folks who are focused more on relationships, they're dreamers. We have inquisitive folks who are focused on relationships, pleasers, and let's not pejorative pleasers, but pleasers. And then inquisitive and focused on tasks are thinkers. And so part of this says is that oftentimes people fall in one of these categories. and sometimes find people in the opposite categories to be exceedingly frustrating, which will be some of what we'll get to. But first, what I want to do is kind of unpack a little bit more about these types, and I would invite you to listen for yourself. And I would invite you to listen for who are the people who annoy me, because again, a lot of conflict is tied to my values and the way I show up, kind of creating a pinch point between me and another person. And so on first blush, if we think about kind of directors, words that we might use to describe them are drivers, conductors, movers, bold. For dreamers, innovators, expressives, shakers, movers and shakers, pleasers, caregivers, diplomats, amiables, people who are steady. And thinkers, we tend to think about people who are analyzers or evaluators or sages. So I want to invite you just to take a minute just to kind of look at these and kind of think, okay, before much detail, where might you see yourself? I invite you to kind of put in the chat, like, just as with all you know right now, where might you put yourself? Are folks thinking? All right, I see a thinker. All right. Thanks, Jacqueline. Director, okay. Dreamer, director. Melinda, I would have guessed dreamer. Pleaser, pleaser. Right, so we're gonna kind of keep talking through this. And again, I would invite you to think, like, where's their resonance? And again, who are those people? Pleaser, pleaser. Oh, I love it. I love it. Okay. So, great. So we're going to kind of go through one by one, and I apologize if this is a little small, but so when we think about those directors, those assertive in tasks, directors often want to stick closely to agendas, calendars, clocks. They hate to waste time. Often, I see those laughing, JB. Often directors are highly opinionated, kind of outspoken, pretty decisive. They can also just want the necessary information. Like, I don't need extra information. Just give me the essentials. They tend to be very logical and linear thinkers. They can value reason over intuition. They like practical ideas that are measurable, tangible, passionate. They're very passionate and energetic about their work. And they don't really love being challenged or corrected. That can be really hard for them. The challenge is that when directors are too task oriented, the needs of the people get lost. Directors can neglect relationship building when there is a job to do. So then programming becomes so important that fellowship is lost, making them not always the best listeners. And then too many directors can be a problem because people want to move in too many different directions. And so again, I don't know if you can think about times in your life where you were in a meeting with a director, or if you yourself are a director where you felt tension when there were other people that were like, come on, like, what are we doing? This is what I think we should do. So directors, again, when we think about leaders, and historically, I think in America, what happens is we tend to value this kind of leader. We also tend to gender this kind of leader. We tend to think like men are directors, and we value men, and we value this assertive and task focused, especially in kind of more corporate settings. And I think sometimes that has trickled down to ministry settings as well, that like kind of this assertive and task oriented is seen somehow as like the best way of being a leader. And part of what I want to do today is gently challenge that this is one way of being a leader, and it can be a lovely way of being a leader, but there's other ways of being leaders. And again, sometimes we do harm when we don't recognize that like all kinds of people can show up as leaders. There's not one way that's the right way. And so I'm going to kind of shift to dreamers. And so dreamers, again, assertive, but people focused and oriented. So dreamers tend to be more artistic and creative and innovative. They're able to think about a lot of things at once. They tend to focus on the big picture and may ignore details. For them, it's like the people, what's happening. They see the forest, not the trees. They tend to be very sociable, very people oriented. They're committed to having a good time. This can make them seem unfocused or disorganized. They are also very talkative, opinionated, and passionate. They maintain high levels of energy and enthusiasm. They don't like being bound by rules, and they tend to argue from feeling and intuition. So you can kind of begin to see how directors and dreamers, they're a little different. Dreamers, the challenge is they don't always know their limits and can sometimes overcommit. They get very excited by all of the people things. And so dreamers can jump horses at midstream because they tend to focus on where their passion is currently. And that means that they can sometimes appear undependable, and that can undermine trust. They can get so wrapped up in people that they lose sight of the task, and they can have trouble seeing other points of view, partly because they see so many different points of view that they've already thought about all of them, and they can be unaware of heading in a wrong direction until it's too late. We like dreamers because they're super fun. They're the brainstorming kings and queens, like all of the ideas, want everyone involved in the conversation, a lot of energy. I am a dreamer. Hi, my name is Amy. Again, we love them, but also sometimes they can be a bit much. Different energy than directors, like let's get it done. And that's where dreamers and directors can feel tension, because the dreamers are like, yeah, let's get it done, but like, let's have fun doing it. And directors are just like, no, let's get it done in the fun, work hard, like first, then we can play. We can't do these things together. Whereas dreamers are like, no, like we can have fun while we're doing this. Makes sense? Y'all with me so far? Okay. So we're gonna keep moving, and then we're gonna kind of think about this on a couple different levels. But pleasers, inquisitive, people focused. So pleasers tend to be people oriented and are more concerned with others than themselves. They place a high priority on other people. They really seek to maintain balance and harmony and civility. They really want to try to keep everyone happy. People's needs take precedence over tasks. They are good listeners and problem solvers. They tend to encourage equality for all members. They will want to avoid unpleasant things, especially conflict and confrontation. So of the group, our pleasers tend to like be the most kind of conflict phobic. They are very flexible and adaptive. They're really open to new ideas. They're very honest, trusting, and loyal. And the challenge is that pleasers, because they're not task oriented, can again appear ineffective. Pleasers don't tend to be visionary leaders. They can spend a lot of time kind of maintaining the status quo. And some of that is just because they want to make sure that the people and where they are in the present moment, like everyone feels good. And so kind of being focused in the present moment means that they don't necessarily always have some of that like forward thinking energy. It's just how can we maintain the harmony that we have. They are sometimes slower by nature, and so that can make a process grind to a halt when it's like, well, what do we all think? Like, let's make sure we're all on the same page. They can be overly sensitive at times and can hold grudges that make it hard to work with them. And pleasers are often less than honest in an effort not to hurt feelings. And they don't always then hold people accountable or delegate responsibility for fear of insulting others. And so it's that tension of they really care what people think and want people to feel well supported, but their own voice sometimes kind of gets lost in that shuffle, then making it difficult when there is something challenging to kind of push against that, or to be really honest. Again, we think about the pleasers in my life are some of my most favorite people, and some of the challenge is like, well, what do you really think about it though? And they can tend to, well, what does the group think? Like, let's come back to the group, and there's gifts for that, but sometimes as leaders, it's also helpful just to hear, well, no, this is what I think. And that can just be harder for pleasers to do. They can do it, but their concern tends to be the group more so than themselves, if that makes sense. Cool. Again, we can think about pleasers in our lives. All right, let me talk about thinkers, and then I'll do some check-in. So our thinkers, inquisitive, task-oriented. These are often the most quiet of the four. They're quiet, they tend to be very laid back. Again, kind of withholding opinions or comments. Our pleasers and our thinkers, that they tend to sort of sit back and are observing what's happening. they're a bit, thinkers are cautious. They don't like making decisions, quick decisions, and they take their work very seriously. They prefer documentation, things in writing. They can hide their own feelings and not always be attentive to the feelings of others. They kind of live, they get the name thinker because they tend to live up here. They are very attentive to like fine details and kind of pointing out potential problems and obstacles. And they're really good at sticking to decisions once made. So they're sort of tend to sit back, observe what's happening, assess, and make plans. And once they've kind of thought through it all, this is what we're going with. The challenge with thinkers, and again, all of these have a shadow side, thinkers can be slow and unwilling to try new things. They can become so focused on the task that, again, the relationships suffer. The other challenge is many thinkers are lone rangers and they don't connect always in fellowship. Again, they tend to live in their heads, not in a malicious way, but just in a like, this is where they live all of the time. And so for those of us who need to feel connected to people, thinkers don't always need to feel that connection. And so they can feel like they're out on an island, and other people can kind of experience them as out on an island. They can be indecisive unless they have a director or dreamer kind of bugging them to hurry up. And thinkers tend to also, kind of like pleasers, withhold information, but then can also sometimes torpedo programs by a rigid adherence to the rules. And so they kind of are leaning back and watching, but if they're thinking and they have their own insights, and sometimes when they do show up, it's like, oh, wait, where did they come from? Because they've been more quiet and passive, kind of as things have happened. So one of the things that I think is really important as we think about this is recognizing like personality is not the same as like interactive styles or leadership styles. So our personality theories, like if you think about the Myers-Briggs, even the Enneagram, kind of helps us understand people's personalities, but not always how they behave. And so what's really helpful in thinking about something like this is like, I may have a personality that again is extroverted or introverted or this or that, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to always behave that way. This is inviting me to think about like, but how do I behave in groups? I like to think of myself as an inquisitive, people focused person, but the reality is in groups, I'm super assertive and extroverted. And it took a while to recognize that, but it was important for me to get really clear about how I showed up. It also became really clear to me that people who are task oriented annoy the hell out of me. I apologize if that is a word that is, I'm going to try not to cuss. That is as close as I'll get. But like task oriented people make me crazy. It's because I grew up in a family where I had parents that were both task oriented. And so, this is where family systems and other things sit on top of this, that because I grew up in a family, I was very task focused. My own desire was to be focused on people, because in some ways I saw the harm of what that taskness did. And so now as an adult, I have to be really cautious when I'm with very task oriented folks, not to just assume that they're terrible or assume that they don't care about people or just think ill of them instead of recognizing, no, they have something to offer me. They have something to offer me, and are really useful to me instead of just assuming that whatever they're offering is harmful. Does that make sense? So let me, I'll kind of put this up and then we'll take a second. So again, the focus on this is when we begin to sort of notice, again, these values towards assertiveness or, ways of being assertiveness or inquisitiveness or task or people focused, it helps us just to understand why we behave and why others behave the way they do in different settings. And I think that also one of the things we're going to talk about next is how stress impacts our behavior. So like, it's one thing for me to kind of be people-y focused and assertive, but when I get stressed, other things happen. I feel conflict in particular kinds of way, which we'll talk about. And so when we begin to think about these ways we behave, then we can also think about, well, how do we behave when we're stressed? And how do we behave in conflict? This way I behave, my particular style also means that I value certain kinds of conversations over others. And how do I have like helpful, productive conversations when there are differences? When I'm encountering someone who's a thinker and I'm a dreamer, so we really are coming at opposites. How do we work together to collaborate? so that one of us isn't kind of railroading the other one. So let's take a second and let me stop and see, do you have any questions so far? Because we're gonna talk about these styles and stress, but are there any kind of questions or observations? Whatever you thought you were in the chat, do you still think that's what you are, or do you see yourself as being something else? Jacqueline, I see that nodding. So you still are team thinker? Okay. How about for others? Do you still resonate with what you originally thought, or would anybody kind of switch at this point?
I definitely still think I'm in the director class, but I want to be a thinker. So
why do you want to be a thinker?
Because I know that I want to take over. So when we're in a group, and Penny Zimmer's on this in this session with us, so she may be able to see how I'm doing in some of the group meetings that we have and different things. But like in the meetings, I'm just like, get it on, get it over with. Like, let's get to the point. But I'm sitting there trying not to say that. So it's a real struggle sometimes. But I'm aware that, that is part of my nature, that I want to get the work. Actually, exactly what you said, like, let's do the work first, then we can visit after. Like, that's literally happening in my head.
Well, I think that's, again, the gift of this is recognizing we have those tendencies. And so how do we, and we may be trying to like bridge and lean a different way. And also people need to lean our way too. And I think that's one of the things that becomes difficult is oftentimes whatever our way is, we tend to just like, either, again, we want people to do it the way we do, or we sort of assume we must not be our way anymore, right? That being a director is bad, which is not true. Directors get a lot of stuff done, and there's shadow sides to it. And I think it is this balance of how do I like live and celebrate the parts about myself that I love, while recognizing that like maybe it's pushy, or maybe it's, spastic or non engaging enough. I think about kind of our inquisitive types, like maybe people need a little bit more from me. And so when do I kind of lean in, or when do I lean out? I think the thing for each of you to kind of think through before we talk about stress is also, again, what annoys you more? So if your relationship focus, do task people annoy you? Or if you're inquisitive, do assertive people annoy you? Or if you're assertive, do inquisitive? Because again, oftentimes there's one of these that makes us a little nuttier. And it may be on the assertive inquisitive line, it may be on the task or people line, but it's also really important to think about like those people who just get under your skin. Who are they? Yeah, I have Why Dreamers Drive Me Nuts. Yeah, like knowing that there's gonna be some type of person that's gonna make me crazy, which means I might have to work harder. It's because they show up in the world very differently than me. So, and again, instead of assuming malintent or just what the hell are they talking about, it's, well, no, there's something going on. They're showing up the way they're showing up. So now how do I like live in relationship with them? Which again can be really hard to do when they're kind of an opposite, or when they represent something. Again, I was using my example of my parents. Like my parents are so task focused that like I responded in a very, I think all of us children, actually all of my siblings, I'm the oldest of 4, we're all very people focused. Like, and I think that it was just a direct response of kind of having parents who just were so focused on tasks that we've all had to learn to value that more. And a lot of conflict in our family is around my mom's like, well, what's the plan? And we're all like, oh, we'll figure it out. We're having fun together. And, that just makes her crazy to this day. So part of, oh, look at y'all being encouraging to one another. Part of what I want to do is kind of transition and talk about what happens to these styles in stress. And so this is, again, another place to kind of notice, how are you showing up? What are you seeing in yourself? And so part of what happens is that oftentimes when we feel stressed, we start to move away from our preferred style. And as we move away from our the preferred style, the more frustrated we can become. Under light stress, we kind of entrench ourselves in our preferred style. But as we feel more and more stress, we start to move. And so I'm going to have these like little images, and y'all will laugh because they're straight from the book. But what happens is if stress increases, all of these types begin to shift to their opposite extreme. So I'm going to walk through what that looks like. And again, this may be a place where you can say, oh, yes, I've been there, done that. So I'm going to start with directors. And so what happens is with directors, when they are under stress, you know, they first are more directory, and then they try to be nice to figure out the people problem. So being that director is not working for them. So like, okay, let me get inquisitive. All right, I'm going to be nice. Like, let's figure out the people thing. If she can't figure out the people thing in the group, then she withdraws to thinker mode because the need to focus on the task is more important than being assertive. And so again, I've moved to first pleasing. Well, that didn't work. So now I'm going to go up to thinking. And then directors will attempt to figure out the problem alone once they've been able to do that in a group. Ultimately, when the directors move to dreamer, then they don't care anymore. So it's like, hey guys, this is what I think we should do. Well, I don't know. Oh, well, what do you all want to do? Well, no. Okay, well, let me think about what I'm going to do. Well, I think we should, what if we did this? Well, I don't care what we do. It's all up to you. I don't care. Like, so what happens is like directors move on these lines. So ultimately, again, pleaser, thinker, and dreamer. But when a director gets to dreamer, like they don't care about the people and they don't care about the task. They're just assertively, whatever you want to do is fine. Does that make sense? But when they're there, their energy is a little higher and their annoyance level is kind of reached a 10. Does that make sense? Okay. Thinkers. So what happens with thinkers, again, is thinkers first stay where they're at, then they allow the group free reign for a time in decision making. So they've been thinking, and so sometimes they're like, okay, let me extrovert. Okay, group, let's brainstorm together. We're doing the people assertive thing because my inquisitive thing wasn't working, but as the deadline draws close, they make a unilateral decision about what may take place. So then again, they get back to task. And so the thinker is first like, well, whatever you think. Okay, I think we should do this. And then if that doesn't work, then again, they lean back and they're like, well, whatever you all want to go with is fine. But in a very kind of inquisitive and I don't care kind of way. You can see what is happening. Once we get to that final line, we don't care about anything anymore. But that's kind of the movements that we make. Does this make sense? Yeah, we're over it by the end. Like by the time we've reached that final straw, when Jacqueline is back in all the way into kind of pleaser mode, she's done. Whatever that final line is. So for pleasers, when pleasers find it impossible to make people happy, they often get directive and make the decision kind of regardless of other people's wishes. And they may do this by narrowing a list of choices. So like, where do y'all want to go to dinner? Well, where do you want to go? Where'd you like to go? Well, here are 3 options. So if there's no consensus, then the dreamer will go into brainstorming. Well, let's brainstorm. Okay, you didn't like my 3 options. Here's some more options. If there's still no consensus, they lock down into thinker mode and kind of move away from others. So, all right, I'm not going to be a part of this conversation anymore. I'm just going to move away. Wherever you all want to go is fine, but I don't care. Again, a more passive, like I don't care. Again, is resonating? The pleasers in the group, is this kind of how you show up? And then our dreamers, when disagreements arise, a dreamer may get quiet and need time to think through the disagreement to determine next steps. So that normally, hey y'all, what are the ideas? Let's brainstorm. I'm like, oh, okay, let me go into my head. Let me do some thinking for myself. If that doesn't really work for them, then they summarize the process and offer a few options to move the group further. So they move into pleaser mode. And then as the discussion continues, dreamers will get forceful and tell the group what they need to do to complete the task. Points to remember that stress moves us away from our preferred style, our comfort zone, our thinking, our dreaming. That's our preferred way. The further we move from our comfort zone, the more dysfunctional our behavior. We want to be done with the task, the group, the people, and just free to move on to other things. And when the extreme of our stress limits, we stop caring about the group, the task, or the people. And I think that's an important thing to kind of remember, is that when we get stressed, right, just our reaction time is just shorter, and we get increasingly kind of more frustrated. Instead of kind of getting curious, I think oftentimes that's when our defenses also often get really high too, because if we're encountering people who are showing up with these different styles, it's not just me and a group of people who are like me, there's all of these different styles that are interacting with one another. And so of course conflict is natural. And I think that's the part of the point of some of this, is oftentimes conflict is always going to be natural when we're in a group of people who is different than us, right? When in this group, there's enough different diversity. So there's always going to be some conflict, because again, we value different things. That person is being so assertive, I wish they would stop talking. Or, oh my gosh, can we just get to the point of this thing, right? We're going to naturally have these, we're going to have these judgments. I think the work is, how do we get curious about those judgments? Like, is my judgment sharper? And is that judgment sharper because I'm stressed? Or is that judgment sharper because, again, I'm channeling my mother? Like, this person, it's not this person, it's this person reminds me of someone else. And so I'm having some negative transference or positive transference. And so just some questions for you all to kind of think about is, just thinking about, and you're welcome to speak this if you feel comfortable or put it in the chat, but can you think of times when stress kind of caused you to alter your behavior? And again, can you see yourself moving on those lines? Like, normally I behave this way, but when I'm in stress, whoosh, I show up in a very different way, which then can kind of make people very curious. Like, if a pleaser starts showing up as a director, oftentimes people are like, whoa, what's going on with them? Because that's not necessarily their preferred way of showing up. And so I think it's really helpful to kind of just think about times. What are the kinds of times that cause you stress? Like, what are those times? What are the factors that make you feel stressed? What might you do to lessen the effect of that stress? How do conversations about stress affect your thinking about groups? When I'm going into meetings and I'm worried about the people or the task, as a people person, I recognize oftentimes with my groups, like, people are super task focused, may find me frustrating. And so that makes me anxious. If I'm already anxious that, like, oh my gosh, this person may already be annoyed with me before this meeting begins because I know they value something differently, I'm probably not going to show up as my best self. So how do I name that? How do I being micromanaged stresses me out too, Jamie. How do I name for a group, like, hey, listen, folks, this is our agenda. We are going to spend a little bit of time doing this, and then we're going to move to these things, right? How does that kind of help everybody know? We're going to, the task oriented people know, okay, maybe we're starting with the people-y stuff first, but we're going to get there, and this is why we're getting there. Or for the people focused, okay, I know where we're going now. How do I infuse some of the people-y parts into this? I think it also helps when we name, we also can prevent the assertive folks from dominating the conversations. Because if I start a meeting with we really want to hear everyone's voice, this is kind of what we're going to do, I want to hear from everyone, that lets our pleasers and our thinkers know we want to hear from you. It's okay if you don't want to speak first, but also we're not going to let the assertive types dominate the conversations, right? So that the thinker and pleaser types never get a word in. Because sometimes thinkers and pleasers want to talk, it's just that they don't want to dominate. And if there's a lot of assertive types will always dominate. That's the challenge. Assertive types have to learn how to shut it. And we're not good at it. And so just even having, I think for me, having these frameworks of a third space to when I'm talking with people, instead of, again, just being it's annoying, you're annoying to me. It's oh, you really value this, or you show up in this way. How can I bless that and figure out what compromise looks like, collaboration looks like, instead of just assuming you're an annoying person. Which again, I think on our best days is part of, or not our best days, that tends to be what happens. We sort of just find people annoying and frustrating instead of appreciating, no, they may be offering me something in this space. Like I might need to be more task focused, or I might need to be more inquisitive. Um, and I think when you have some frameworks like this that kind of make people people and value those differences, it just the conflict kind of can lessen. I do want to show this fun slide because it is kind of what we do in conflict. Again, part of what this says is that when styles experience conflict, it shows up in very particular ways. And so directors, we'll start in the top quadrant, we'll work our way down. Directors at the lowest level of conflict, they just want to confront. Like if there's a conflict, directors like want to confront it. Like, let's talk about this. If that doesn't work, or if they start to feel stressed, they tend to get a bit more forceful with their conflicts. So no, we're going to talk about this right now. I'm really frustrated. Like, let's keep going. And if that doesn't work, then they kind of do what this calls is functional attack. Like, okay, I just need to get what I want done, and I'm going to plan out how to make it done. Like, forget the people-y stuff. I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to I'm going to create the plan that helps me achieve my goals. Does that make sense? I see those nods, right? Like, confront it, more forceful in it. All right, it's done. Again, once we get to the outer level, that typically is like not good. You know, when we kind of get to the second level, I think that's a warning sign. So if a director notices themselves getting more forceful in their confrontation, oftentimes that can be like the warning shot of like, ooh, okay, let me check in with myself before I all out functional attack. For dreamers first would argue. Like if a conflict occurs, they're gonna, well, I could see this way, or maybe I kind of disagree. It's not quite as confrontational because right, they're people focused. So like, well, I don't know. And if that doesn't work, then they get defensive. Well, this is my perspective. I am not trying to ruffle feathers. And then they just get, well, that's fine. I'm going to agree to this, but over here, I'm going to let you have it. So retribution is like kind of a functional attack. I'm going to make this happen. Retribution is much more kind of passive because, we're people focused, but like they will not be a part of these meetings anymore. Or I'm going to make sure they're not included anymore. Or, oh, I'll show them they're going to get all the tasks the next time. Does that make sense? So it's less functional, intentional, but it's more passive, but also I'll show them. Kind of, I'm going to cut them off. Or I'm going to make them do things they don't want to do. Most helpful way. Again, this is sort of showing our shadows. For pleasers in conflict, they want to avoid it. Like again, goal one is like, conflict is not necessary. Let's do what we can to avoid it. It's unpleasant. When that doesn't work, they start to get anxious, like, oh gosh, ooh, there is conflict and I don't know what to do, and oh, I can't avoid it. I want to avoid it. And then again, if it's not dealt with, then they either personally attack or feel personally attacked. So like, why are you doing this to me? Why are you coming at me at this? Like, why is this conflict? I'm not a part of this. Like they make it personal, or they personalize it. Like, why are you coming at me? Or I'm going to come at you. Like, you're being a bad human right now by like pushing me on this thing. Does that make sense? Again, when we're in the anxious part, that may be the signal to like, gosh, I'm feeling really anxious about this. Why am I feeling anxious? Oh, maybe I'm going to have to sort of speak up and name something. Like maybe there's something helpful that I can do versus like, how dare they? They're an evil person. So it's different than that functional attack, because the functional attack is like, I'm going to just plan to dominate. The personalizing is, it's not about the task, it's about the person. And then finally, our thinkers. So they're going to start with persuading, using our heads. If that doesn't work, they're going to get kind of stoic and sort of, again, that retreat back in, try to kind of be indifferent, like And then when that doesn't work, then they explode. Thinkers, when they explode, isn't always a pretty thing because, again, it's so different. I think that's, especially for both thinkers and pleasers, when thinkers and pleasers get to those points, I mean, I think it's true of all of them. When all of these points get to those far edges, it's oftentimes surprising. I think it's a little more surprising when inquisitive types do it because, again, it's the assumption is they don't speak up. And so when that explosion happens or when that personal attack happens, it's very surprising. When a dreamer gets retributive, like it's unexpected because it's like, oh, I thought we were having fun and now I'm uninvited to all of these meetings. Like, what's going on? Or functional attack is the most consistent, directors in terms of like, nope, I'm going to do it. We're going to get the task done. And so maybe it's a little bit more consistent. But all of these, again, the warning sign is how do we, when we get into that feeling place, it's that kind of that middle quadrant, how do we just check in before we get to those outer edges? Because again, once we get to those outer edges, we're not really using our thinking and our feeling are not together, right? We're just reacting. And anytime we react, that's going to be just less useful to us. And so it looks like with the time I have remaining, I'm going to jump over this. I'm going to talk a little bit about, apologize for my dog, harmonizing. So how do we harmonize with these types? So when we're dealing with directors, and let me stop by saying harmonizing is, again, recognizing that there's a variety of behavioral styles. And so how do I appreciate what this style is offering and what is something that this style may need from me when I'm a different type? So if I'm not a director, these are things that help me know how to work better with directors. And so when dealing with directors, remember that they really value punctuality, structure, and order. Have your facts at hand and don't spend too much time on small talk. Stay focused, make sure you make clear and concise statements. Directors appreciate eye contact, honesty, clarifying questions. They don't like debate, but they like well-reasoned and balanced opinions. And so again, if you're working with directors, just know they really value kind of getting to the point, and they value reason. And so if you don't show up that way, that's okay, but how do I recognize that this may be something this person needs? If this is like an elder, if I'm a pleaser and my lead elder is a director, there may be some tension. How do we find some ways of working with one another that is finding a happy balance? With dreamers, when you're working with dreamers, stay flexible and tolerant. Dreamers see deadlines and rules as restrictive. They love to talk about ideas and they need people to look at lots of different options. So getting along with them requires the ability to talk feelings as well as thinking, and what if as well as what is. Because for dreamers, they like to dream. Like, it doesn't have to be this way. Like, what if we did this or this or this or this? And so if there's no space for like imagination and imagining something to look different, dreamers will really struggle. If they lose interest, or their energy level drops, and they're going to disengage because their energy is kind of what helps them. And so if it doesn't matter, if we're not going to dream or brainstorm about anything, oftentimes dreamers are going to disconnect because that's so much of what they love doing. Just because dreamers don't produce agendas or minutes or policies, it doesn't mean that they're lazy or careless. Oftentimes dreamers have huge amounts of information in their heads, and if you spend some time helping them retrieve that information, it's typically really well worth the effort because they do so much sort of thinking and engaging. And again, when I think about creative imagination, I think the church is in desperate need of it. I think dreamers tend to be those risk-taking, innovative folks that are like, well, what if we did it this way? And again, that can be seen as very threatening, especially if we're stressed. But recognizing that dreamer may be offering me something, and they may not be critiquing me. The what if we did it this way doesn't have to be because what we're doing wrong. It's just an innovative new idea. I think this is also a tension with like kind of young and old in our congregations, right? When we begin to think about like, what if we do things differently? Folks can see that as a threat to like institution or tradition when it's not meant to be a threat. It's just a way of engaging. Like, I want to offer something. And so how do we hear that? Even if we're going to stay with a what is, how do we not like kind of crush? that energy that often is a gift to us. With pleasers tend to be the easiest people to get along with. We love pleasers. They work best with those who maintain an even temper and a balanced perspective. So, arguing or raising your voice is going to bring some anxiety because they tend to do better when it's like, let's just all be civil, let's all be kind. It's important to be clear with your expectations and instructions. Like, you don't want to pull surprises or expect pleasers to read your mind. They will do just about anything you ask of them, but will only resent it if they feel taken advantage of. So they will give and give and give as soon as and until it becomes an expectation. And then that is where they will get resentful because they're doing it because they care, not because like you told them to. Pleasers want to make sure everyone is included and listened to, and pleasers thrive when there's lots of free-flowing communication and follow-up. Again, pleasers are going to have a hard time with like one person dominated directors, right? If pleasers are wanting to hear everyone's point of view, and so if there's that one, again, elder or deacon or teacher who's directing everything, that's going to be really challenging because oftentimes that person may be dominating. And again, if you have a pleaser, if you as a leader are a pleaser, there may be times where you have directors who are anxious because they feel like you're not doing enough. And sometimes as a pleaser, it's important to just say, I have a plan. This is the plan, follow me, and kind of be a little bit more assertive because those directors just need to know that there is a plan. They're going to assume that there's not if you don't kind of name it at times. And then with our thinkers, patience is kind of more than a virtue. It's kind of essential. Again, giving them the space to kind of think and explore all the options. They want as much information as possible before making decisions. Working silence into your process is really important. Again, oftentimes when we're in meetings and things, people just talk and talk and talk and talk versus like, let's all just take 5 minutes. Like, let's all just kind of get centered before we start talking. Like, let's everybody think and reflect. And for thinkers, it's really important to just follow formal procedures and establish clear boundaries. Like, if there's a plan, like, let's stick to the plan. Again, apologize for my dog. Yes, I'm happy to share my slides. So I'm going to put this up and then I'll take my screen down and we can chat. But there is something called the helping style inventory. And this is, again, it's something slightly different. It's the same kind of directive, facilitative, person-centered, task-oriented. It's just that they're switched. So task-oriented and director is over on this side, managers. Directive, person-oriented, the guide. Facilitative, person-oriented are pleasers or the celebrant. Task, facilitative thinkers are the consultant. And this helping style also thinks about, like, as the style that I am, so as a dreamer, or in this case, the guide, part of the way I show up in my pastoral care may be in kind of informing, a coaching, or directing way. That's really helpful to some people, but for other people, they may need me to show up in a different way. They may need me to show up more as the consultant, which is more conversing, exploring, and collaborating. Or as a celebrant, connecting and supporting and confirming. And so I love this little image because part of the other thing it says is, how do we tap in to the ways of being that we aren't, but are still skills that we can learn? So again, where that manager, director might be focused on suggesting and advising and instructing, there may be times where, again, with a parishioner, I need to take a more celebrant, passive approach. They may need me to show up in a different way. And so I love this kind of, and there's a great article I can send you all, that how do we live into the way we are, and how do we recognize, especially with the people in our lives that we're offering care to, they may need something different. So there's one thing to think about how we interact with our colleagues. It's another thing when we think about how we interact with, like, our people. And that's tricky because sometimes the people on the meetings are still our parishioners, right? And so there's this tricky balance of, like, how do I hold both of these things in tension? And so I think for me, this language, all of these words just give me a way to think about what I'm seeing, experiencing. And so when we take time to sort of just reflect on how, for me, reflect on how people show up and recognize where they might be falling, it just helps me not personalize like the tensions or the conflicts. And it helps me see that person and not just the thing that's frustrating me, which I think does ultimately help me deal with conflict with other people. Because again, I'm not assuming kind of this malintent or just annoyance. But I'm like, oh, wow, they're really concerned that the task isn't being done. And that's really worrisome to them. How do I kind of address that while also maintaining, like, I've got it, especially as the leader? Does this make sense? So let me just sort of stop because we're kind of at time. I will say, like, Dan Dick is the person who kind of came up with this lovely little book, Leadership and Interactive Styles, Understanding Why We Behave the Way We Do in Groups. And so if this as an inventory is super helpful to you, this is a really great resource. I'm also happy to kind of pass these slides along. The helping style inventory is slightly different. I can send a separate article. But let me kind of stop sharing. And yeah, see kind of in the time we have remaining, like helpful, useful questions, comments.
I would just say if anyone wants these resources, eventually they will go out through the region, but there is a lot of regional assembly planning, so it may take some time. So if you want these, just put your name and your email down in the chat, and I'll make sure that that goes ahead out to you, the slides and whatever other resources that you might want. And Amy, I really appreciate the way you say how we show up and recognizing what our nature is when we show up. Like I realize, and that takes work. Like it takes self-work, which is something that we don't, like to do in a lot of cases. Like we want to just show up to be who we are and not worry about how everybody else is doing, So yeah, especially when it comes to task. Now, when we're in pastoral care and other, other situations, how we show up is going to be a little bit different. But specifically with task and then in church leadership, we really do find that there's a lot of clashing of personalities, I guess, there, and how to kind of, instead of taking it personally, kind of how can I manage this and meet everyone's needs to get to the common goal. So I really appreciate that use of the word. How do I show up, and how can I show up differently to help meet someone else's, needs? So I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's just funny that when we're stressed and we're so focused on task, like, I mean, we have to be, right? When we're in leadership roles, there's a level, even if we're not task oriented, like I'm not task focused, but like I have got lots of responsibility, which means sometimes when I have to lean into that, like that is a pinch point for me, right? If you're someone who's task oriented, but you got to deal with the interpersonal people stuff, that can be tricky. And it's like this, yeah, so helpful when I know, okay, I'm feeling super stressed because I'm having to be super focused. I got to put, in my work, I have to put these binders together for the beginning of orientation. And it's so detail focused and oriented. And that is not my way, which means I have a level of stress. So if someone's like, hey, but the syllabus doesn't say this, or the schedule isn't clear, I am already ramped up on a stress level because I know that it's not something I'm good at. Or again, if I don't love conflict and I already know I'm going to go into a meeting where there is conflict between other people, I'm already going in with some anxiety. And if I just take that minute to reflect, right? If I just pause, do some self-reflection, I can show up as a much calmer, like, person, right? And that helps other people calm down. And I do think that's one of the things that's like that oxygen mask that we're all taught, like you put your own oxygen mask on first. And I think as ministers, we suck at this, right? We're really bad at this because we want to help other people. And so we prioritize other people thinking that ultimately that's going to help. And it's like, no, you need to calm down. Like if we're calm, we can model that for other people. And for me, that's the part of this that's really convicting is I think I'm helping people, but I'm not helping them if I'm not modeling kind of a calm, warm presence and like curious instead of defensive. And so I think as a minister, as a leader, it's recognizing that like my ability to kind of not react models for other people the way that I hope they react to one another. But if I'm super reactionary, I'm kind of modeling a behavior in my church community that they're going to be reactionary to the people that are underneath them. And so I think there is kind of a cumulative effect of this, that the more I can kind of be affirming of people's difference. And like, I hear, Jamie, that like, you're really concerned that we're not addressing the task. Thank you. And I want to make sure I get to that. Or, you know, we've really heard a lot from Bill, Frank, and Paul. Thank you so much. But I really, you know, we haven't heard a lot from Jackie and Kara. And so, you know, let's give them some space. Let's hear what they think. And I think it's, again, as the leader, kind of recognizing, like, we're all humans. We all show up in the world differently. Let me be calm. Let me be curious. That I think life it's just easier. And I think the conflict feels less intense. So, anyways, thank you for letting me be here again. Any final words or questions? But happy to share all the resources. I can send them to Jamie. And just happy to be on journey with you all. It's fun to be here with you all.
Thank you. We enjoyed it. It was great. We appreciate your presentation.
Thanks, Martha. Thank you.
Great. Thank Amy, thanks again so much for sharing your wisdom, and we'll remember to show up different when we're feeling a little bit agitated from now on. So thank you for that.
I will say turning to wonder is something that really helps me. Like, you know, maybe final note is that when I start to get really frustrated, and it's a disciples minister that coined this phrase of like turning to wonder. Like, I wonder what's going on with them. I wonder what's going on with me. That instead of jumping to judgment, like if we suspend judgment by turning to wonder, even like, I really wonder why they decided to make that choice and say that really arrogant thing. I wonder what was going on with them, or like, I wonder what's going on with me that I'm feeling very defensive in this moment. It kind of keeps us in that curious place. And so I love this just as a practice. Like, whenever I get really frustrated, it's just like, well, I'm curious about my frustration and welcome it, not as a bad thing, right? Because we can also judge our judgments. And so sometimes it's like, that's not helpful either. Like, I am having this feeling. I am getting tripped up by something. So like, what's going on? As it is a gentle invitation to ourselves. Again, I think it certainly helps me show up better with other people, especially ones that I want to punch. Because we all have the days, right? When like you just said something really stupid and I want to tell you, but it's like, And sometimes I will give you my last little tip. Tell me, help me understand, Martha, like where, I really want to hear you. Can you help me understand that? That's my nice way of being like, I'm so frustrated with you, but like, help me understand. I would really love to understand. And it's this way of like leaning in, but like, again, reining in. I do want to understand. I'm feeling defensive, but my curiosity is now helping me kind of lean in instead of leaning out, right? And I think that's often what we do in conflict. We just want to lean out versus like, there's a reason why they're behaving this way. Let me get curious about that. So anyways, thank you. A little extra unsolicited.
Thank you so much. Well, y'all have a great night. So glad again to have you with us. Y'all have a blessed week. Amy, thank you again so much. And I hope we'll hear from you again soon, hopefully in our next year's sessions, because you have so much to offer on leadership and all of the Enneagram. I know a lot of people are interested in that too. So we look forward to hearing more from you. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning into this session. And I hope you all have a blessed and wonderful week.
Thank you. Hey, y'all.